There is a document. It is not a blurry photograph. It is not the testimony of a single witness with no corroboration. It is not a story passed down through years of retelling until the details no longer hold. It is a memorandum, written on official letterhead, signed by a lieutenant colonel of the United States Air Force, sent to the British Ministry of Defense, declassified and released under the Freedom of Information Act. It describes, in the flat, precise language of military reporting, the events of 3 nights in December of 1980 in a forest on the eastern coast of England. And what it describes has never been explained. Not by the United States Air Force. Not by the British government. Not by anyone. The document exists. The events it describes happened. And the forest it names, Rendlesham Forest, still stands in Suffolk, England. Quiet. Dense. Dark at night. Exactly as it was on the night of December 26, 1980. When American soldiers walked into it and found something that should not have been there. To understand what happened in Rendlesham Forest, you need to understand the geography of the place. On the eastern coast of England, in the county of Suffolk, there are 2 military installations that sit side by side, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge. In December of 1980, both bases were operated by the United States Air Force under a NATO agreement. They were among the most strategically important American military installations in Europe. They were also, according to multiple sources and declassified documents, nuclear-armed. Between the 2 bases lies Rendlesham Forest. A managed forest of pine trees, approximately 1,500 acres, that in winter is dark and still and dense enough to lose your bearings within minutes. The forest is bordered on one side by the perimeter fence of RAF Woodbridge. On the night of December 26, 1980, shortly after midnight, a security patrol near the east gate of RAF Woodbridge reported seeing lights in the forest. Not lights on the perimeter. Not lights from the base. Lights coming from within the trees. The patrol reported the lights to the base. The initial assumption was that a civilian aircraft might have gone down in the forest. 2 security officers were sent to investigate. Their names were Jim Penniston and John Burroughs. What they encountered in that forest was not a downed aircraft. Airman First Class John Burroughs and Staff Sergeant Jim Penniston entered Rendlesham Forest on foot, following the lights. As they moved deeper into the trees, they described experiencing something unusual. Their radios began malfunctioning. Static. Interference that made communication with the base difficult and then impossible. The hair on their arms stood up. There was a feeling that Penniston would later describe as a charge in the air, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. And then they came into a small clearing. And they saw it. Penniston's description, given in interviews across the following decades and documented in his official statements, is detailed and consistent. A craft. Not an aircraft in the conventional sense. A triangular object, approximately 3 meters wide at its base and approximately 2 meters tall. The surface was smooth. Black and glassy, like polished obsidian. It rested on 3 landing struts that left impressions in the soft forest floor. It was illuminated. Not by external lights, but from within. A glow that Penniston described as white and yellow, radiating through the craft itself. And it was not making a sound. John Burroughs stopped at the edge of the clearing, overwhelmed by something he would later describe as both awe and a deep, instinctive warning. He did not approach. Penniston walked forward. He circled the object slowly. He observed it. He took photographs with his camera. And then he placed his hand on its surface. He would say, in interviews years later, that the moment his hand made contact with the craft, something happened. A flood of images and information. A sequence of sensations that he could not explain rationally but that felt, in the moment, like transmission. Like something was being communicated through the physical contact. He and Burroughs remained in the clearing for approximately 45 minutes. And then the craft lifted. Without sound. Without disturbance of the air around it. Without the physics that any lift-capable vehicle of that size should have required. It rose above the tree line. And it was gone. Penniston and Burroughs returned to the base and reported what they had seen. Their superior officers were skeptical. The official base log from that night described the incident in minimal terms. Lights were observed in the forest. Personnel investigated. Nothing of significance was found. But Penniston had a notebook. And in the hours following his encounter in the clearing, in a state he later described as almost automatic, he filled pages of that notebook with symbols. A series of shapes that he said he had seen on the surface of the craft. Geometric markings etched or embedded in the smooth material, running along the craft's body in a band. He copied them as precisely as he could. The notebook existed. The symbols were documented. And decades later, those symbols would generate a revelation that no one in 1980 had the technology to process. We will come back to that. The following morning, daylight brought the physical evidence. 3 indentations in the forest floor. Arranged in a triangular pattern. Each indentation approximately 7 centimeters deep. The pattern was consistent with the landing struts Penniston had described. The ground around the indentations was broken. Branches on the nearby trees were snapped. At a height consistent with an object of the size Penniston described. A Geiger counter was brought in to measure radiation levels at the site. The readings were elevated. Not dangerously so. But elevated above background levels in a pattern that radiated outward from the central area of the landing marks. The physical evidence was documented. Photographs were taken. Measurements were recorded. And the base command informed the British Ministry of Defence. The British Ministry of Defence sent a representative to the base, who looked at the evidence and determined there was no threat to national security, and left. The third night was the most extraordinary. December 28, 1980. 2 nights after Penniston and Burroughs had encountered the object in the clearing. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt was the deputy base commander of RAF Bentwaters. He was a career military officer. Experienced. Rational. Not a man given to imagination or embellishment. He had been briefed on the events of December 26. He was skeptical. He did not believe what his men had reported. And then, on the night of December 28, the lights returned. This time, Halt decided to see for himself. He assembled a team. He took a night vision light-all, a portable lighting unit. He took radiation detectors. He took equipment to document what they found. And he took a portable tape recorder. He intended to record everything in real time. That recording still exists. It is one of the most remarkable pieces of audio in the history of unexplained aerial phenomena. The Halt tape. For 17 minutes, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt narrates what his team is experiencing as they move through Rendlesham Forest. The recording is in his voice. Calm, initially. Precise. Military. And then it is not calm. The tape begins with Halt describing the light-all equipment malfunctioning. The powerful portable lighting unit they brought to illuminate the forest is failing. New batteries are being inserted. The unit fails again. He notes it on the tape. They move deeper into the forest. Halt describes lights ahead of them. Between the trees. He describes an object. Dripping something. He uses that word. Dripping. As if the object is shedding material. The object is moving. It is not stationary. It moves through the trees, and Halt's team follows it. The radiation detector registers elevated readings as they approach the area where the object appears to be. And then Halt describes something in the sky. Objects. Multiple. Moving. One of them, he says, appears to be sending beams of light downward. Beams directed toward the ground. Toward the base. His voice does not break. But the precision of his language changes. Because the commanding officer of one of the most strategically important American military installations in Europe is standing in a forest in the middle of the night watching something he cannot identify send beams of light toward his base. And he is recording it. Because even in that moment, Charles Halt understands that documentation is what separates an incident from a rumor. The tape ends. The objects eventually move away. Halt and his team return to the base. And he sits down to write. On January 13, 1981, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt wrote a memorandum. It was addressed to the British Ministry of Defence. It was titled, Unexplained Lights. In 3 short paragraphs, Halt described the events of December 26 and December 28. The lights. The object observed by Penniston and Burroughs. The landing marks. The radiation readings. The events of the third night. The beams of light directed toward the base. He wrote it in the language of a military report. Direct. Unembellished. Professional. He signed it. And he sent it to the Ministry of Defense. The memorandum was classified. It was not declassified until 1983, when it was released under a Freedom of Information Act request. When it became public, it did not generate the response it deserved. The Cold War was ongoing. The world had other things to focus on. But the document was real. It remains real. A signed, official military memorandum from a United States Air Force lieutenant colonel describing encounters with an unidentified object in a British forest over 3 consecutive nights. It is not an allegation. It is a document. The British government's response to the Halt memorandum was, at the time, dismissive. The Ministry of Defense acknowledged receipt of the memo. It conducted what it described as an investigation. And it concluded that the events described posed no threat to national security and were of no defense significance. That was the official position. And it has remained the official position. But in the decades since, documents released under the Freedom of Information Act have told a more complicated story. Internal Ministry of Defense communications from the period reveal that officials were more interested in the Rendlesham incident than the public response suggested. Documents show discussions about the radiation readings and what they might indicate. Communications about the credibility of the witnesses. References to the incident in contexts that suggest it was not treated as trivially as the official statements implied. Nick Pope worked for the British Ministry of Defence from 1985 to 2006. For 3 of those years, he ran the ministry's UFO desk. His job was to investigate reports of unidentified aerial phenomena and assess their significance to national security. He has spoken and written extensively about the Rendlesham incident. Pope considers it one of the strongest cases in the documented history of unidentified aerial phenomena. He has said that the combination of evidence, multiple credible military witnesses, physical traces on the ground, radiation readings, an official document written and signed by a senior officer in real time, and the audio recording made during the events, makes Rendlesham uniquely difficult to dismiss. He has also said that, in his assessment, the British government never fully investigated the incident. That the conclusion of no defense significance was reached too quickly. And that the questions raised by the evidence were never properly answered. Now let us address the explanations that have been offered over the years. The most commonly cited official explanation for what the witnesses saw is the Orford Ness Lighthouse. Orford Ness is a spit of land on the Suffolk coast, approximately 5 miles from Rendlesham Forest. There is a lighthouse on Orford Ness. Its light rotates and is visible across a wide area on clear nights. The argument is that the witnesses, disoriented in the dark forest, mistook the rotating beam of the lighthouse for an unidentified craft. It is a tidy explanation. It is also almost completely unsatisfactory. Jim Penniston and John Burroughs were security personnel at a base that sat within visual range of Orford Ness. They knew the lighthouse existed. They could see it on clear nights from the base perimeter. They were not unfamiliar with what a lighthouse beam looks like. And the lighthouse does not explain a craft that Penniston physically approached and touched. It does not explain 3 indentations in the forest floor in a triangular pattern. It does not explain elevated radiation readings at the site of those indentations. It does not explain the snapped branches at a height consistent with a large object. And it does not explain the objects that Halt's team observed moving through the trees, or the beams of light directed toward the base. A lighthouse on a fixed point 5 miles away does not move through a forest. It does not drip material. It does not direct beams toward a military installation. The lighthouse theory accounts for a glowing light in the forest. It does not account for what the evidence actually shows. There is an aspect of this case that is almost never discussed in mainstream accounts. The bases at Bentwaters and Woodbridge were nuclear-armed. This is not a theory. It is a documented historical fact, confirmed by declassified documents and official statements released decades after the events. In December of 1980, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge held some of the largest stockpiles of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. The weapons were stored in hardened shelters on the base. The significance of this is something that researchers have raised and that the official investigations have never addressed. If the object that appeared over Rendlesham Forest on those 3 nights in December was intelligently controlled, if it was something other than a natural phenomenon or a misidentified conventional object, then its presence over one of the largest nuclear weapons storage facilities in Western Europe is not incidental. It may be the point. Multiple witnesses, including Halt himself in later interviews, have noted that the beams of light observed on the 3rd night appeared to be directed specifically toward the weapons storage area of the base. Halt has said in interviews that he believes the object was real, intelligently controlled, and that its interest in the base was not random. a senior United States Air Force officer, saying that something intelligently controlled appeared over his nuclear-armed base and directed light toward where the weapons were stored. That statement has never been formally addressed by the United States Air Force or the British Ministry of Defense. Now we return to Jim Penniston's notebook. For decades, the symbols he copied from the surface of the craft remained exactly that, symbols. Geometric markings documented in a personal notebook by a military officer who had no framework to interpret them. In 2010, Penniston collaborated with researchers to apply a new lens to his notes. Among the symbols and sketches, he had also written, in the hours following his encounter, a sequence of ones and zeros. Binary code. He did not know, in 1980, that he was writing binary code. The notation was instinctive. Something that emerged from whatever he experienced in the clearing that night. When researchers applied standard binary to ASCII conversion to the sequence, the code decoded. It produced coordinates. Geographic coordinates. Latitude and longitude. The coordinates pointed to specific locations on Earth. Among them, the island of Hy-Brasil, a legendary island in Irish mythology said to appear from the sea every 7 years. The pyramids of Giza. The Nazca lines in Peru. And embedded in the decoded message was a phrase. Exploration of humanity. There are researchers who question the decoding methodology, who argue that binary sequences can be made to produce almost any result depending on how they are parsed. There are others who note that the coordinates are precise, that the locations they identify are not random, that the connection to ancient and mysterious sites on Earth suggests something deliberate. Whether Penniston received a transmission on that night in 1980, or whether his mind produced something extraordinary under extreme stress, the notebook exists. The binary sequence exists. And the decoded coordinates exist. Make of them what you will. In the years following the public release of the Halt memorandum, the Rendlesham incident attracted a level of investigation and documentation that few cases in this field have received. Multiple witnesses came forward. Among them, Larry Warren, an airman who claimed to have witnessed events on the second night that were even more dramatic than those described in the official accounts. His testimony has been disputed by other witnesses, and his credibility has been questioned by some researchers. But the core of the case, the events documented by Penniston, Burroughs, Halt, and the physical evidence they left behind, has not been dependent on Warren's account. The case stands on what is documented. The memorandum. The audio recording. The radiation readings. The landing marks. The photographs. The testimony of multiple military witnesses who maintained their accounts through decades of public scrutiny. In 2015, John Burroughs and his legal representatives reached a settlement with the United States Department of Veterans Affairs regarding medical treatment for conditions Burroughs attributed to his exposure to whatever he encountered in Rendlesham Forest on the night of December 26. As part of that settlement, classified documents relating to Burroughs's exposure were reviewed by his legal team under a security clearance arrangement. The Department of Veterans Affairs agreed to treat conditions related to the Rendlesham incident. Think about what that means. The United States government, through its Veterans Affairs system, acknowledged that John Burroughs was injured by exposure to something during the Rendlesham Forest incident. Not by an aircraft crash. Not by a training accident. By the Rendlesham Forest incident. And agreed to treat him for it. That is not an allegation. That is a legal settlement. With the government. Charles Halt continued to speak about Rendlesham for decades. He gave interviews. He testified at unofficial hearings. He signed declarations. He said, repeatedly and consistently, that what he witnessed on the night of December 28, 1980, was real. That it was not the lighthouse. That it was not a natural phenomenon. That it was not a misidentification. He said that the United States Air Force and the British government know more about what happened than they have disclosed. He said that there was a cover-up. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, but a deliberate choice by institutions to minimize, dismiss, and discourage investigation of events that they could not explain and did not want to be asked to explain. Charles Halt is not a conspiracy theorist. He is a retired United States Air Force lieutenant colonel with a career of 34 years. He wrote the memorandum. He made the tape. He was there. And he has been saying the same thing for 40 years. What do we know for certain? We know that on the nights of December 26 and 28, 1980, personnel from the United States Air Force assigned to RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge reported encounters with unidentified objects in Rendlesham Forest. We know that Jim Penniston and John Burroughs approached an object in the forest on the first night and that Penniston made physical contact with it. We know that physical evidence was found on the forest floor the following morning, 3 indentations in a triangular pattern, broken branches, and radiation readings elevated above background levels. We know that Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt led a team into the forest on the 3rd night and made an audio recording of their observations in real time. We know that Halt wrote and signed an official military memorandum describing these events and sent it to the British Ministry of Defence. We know that the British government concluded the events posed no defence significance without conducting what independent observers consider a thorough investigation. We know that classified documents relating to the incident exist and that some have been released while others have not. We know that the United States Department of Veterans Affairs settled a legal claim acknowledging that John Burroughs was injured during the Rendlesham incident. What we do not know is what the objects were. What we do not know is who or what operated them. What we do not know is why they appeared over a nuclear-armed military installation on 3 consecutive nights. What we do not know is what the beams of light directed toward the weapons storage area were intended to do. And what we do not know is what information remains classified after more than 40 years. Information that the people who were there believe exists. And that the governments involved have never fully released. There is a path in Rendlesham Forest now. The local authorities built it. They called it the UFO Trail. A walking route through the trees that passes the area where the landing marks were found. There are information boards. There is a metal sculpture marking the spot. Tourists walk it on weekends. They take photographs by the sculpture. They look up through the pine trees at the sky. And they try to imagine what it was like to be Jim Penniston or John Burroughs on that December night in 1980. To walk those same trees in the dark. To follow lights that should not have been there. To come into a clearing and find something resting on the forest floor that no training, no experience, no frame of reference in a lifetime of military service had prepared them for. To reach out and touch it. And to feel something touch back. The forest is quiet. The bases still operate, under British control now, with a fraction of their former significance. The memorandum is in archives. The tape is in archives. The notebooks are in Penniston's possession. The questions are still unanswered. And somewhere in the filing systems of the American and British governments, in the sections that have never been released, in the documents that were written and classified and have not yet seen daylight after 4 decades? May be the answer to what landed in Rendlesham Forest in December of 1980. To what Penniston touched. To what Halt recorded. To what those beams of light were looking for. In the dark. Over the weapons. In the trees.